And today also, we've already just said some greetings and that, but we recognize on a day like today, there's often some folks who are here because of Mother's Day. Maybe you're with your mom or with your family, and just want to give a special welcome to all of you who are with us here today. Great to have you with us. We welcome a chance just to celebrate with you and to worship with you today. We have been in a message series that's called Unleashing Hope. We launched into it the Sunday after Easter. We're taking 7 weeks, 50 days to look at hope. And this is kind of our premise, and I've said this the last few weeks, but I'll say it again today, that more than anything else in our lives, for us to be the people God has called us to be, we need the hope of the Lord in our lives. That I can't be the father that God has called me to be if I'm discouraged. I can't be the pastor God has called me to be. I can't be the neighbor to my neighbors. If I'm discouraged, if I'm focused on myself, if I'm down in the dumps, I can't be the person God wants me to be. God's called us to live in hope in the Lord. And what we're looking at each of these weeks is what are 7 factors that, if we understand them in our lives, gives a foundation for hope. Hope isn't just some kind of idea that we just aspire to, but there's practical steps we take in our lives to live in hope. And that's what we're talking about each of these Sundays. We began by talking about recharging our batteries. We looked at Jesus' life. We saw how Jesus took time away to pray, and how for many of us, and I speak here to mothers, because mothers, maybe more than anybody else, they think of others, they don't think of themselves. They think of their kids. And I love that video too. Sometimes it's even just that woman who invests in the lives of others. Maybe it's not even your kids. Maybe it's you're a mentor. Maybe it's just people around you. But we might fail to invest in ourselves. That's what we talked about the first week. Taking time to pull away, to allow our own batteries to get recharged. And we saw Jesus' life and how he did that. Last week we looked at Gideon. And Gideon gives the example of us seeing our lives as God sees them, not just staying focused on the present, but on the future, which leads us into today as well. God said to Gideon, mighty warrior, when Gideon was shrinking back and hiding and in despair. Today we're going to be looking at 3 women. We are going to be looking at Jochebed, maybe you haven't heard a lot about, and in our relatively brief time here, we don't have, for 3 people, we don't have a lot of time to talk about all 3 of them, but what we want to pull out with each of these 3 is that instead of staying in discouragement, and instead of allowing their present circumstances to dictate their reality, they saw their situations for what might become. That for each of them, by God's grace fueled them for a future vision. They saw their circumstances not as what's impossible, but for what this can become. And that's what any great mom does as well, that sees their children not just for who they are, but for who they will become. Think of Jesus. Jesus did that. Jesus pulled 12 disciples together. They weren't the prime examples of faith. I mean, think of Thomas, who doubted. Think of Peter, who just would keep saying things. He had this disease, foot and mouth disease. Just kind of kept putting his foot in his mouth and, saying things that just, Jesus says, Peter, no, that's not it. Think of James and John. They had a nickname. They were called Sons of Thunder. Jesus' disciples, Matthew, a tax collector. Jesus saw them not for who they were, but for who they would become. Proverbs 31:25 says, strength and dignity are her clothing, and she smiles at the future. So we're going to look at these three women, what happens in their life, but not only what happens in their life, but their future as well. And as we lead into this, I came across about a 1.5-minute video clip I want to show just before we launch into it. This is Kevin Durant. He was the MVP of the NBA this year. And I don't follow the NBA closely. Yesterday, we had a guy named Terry Bates with us meeting with some of our leaders. And Terry is from Oklahoma City. Kevin Durant plays on the Oklahoma City Thunder. And Terry said to me yesterday morning, he said, Mark, I don't know if you've heard of this, but Terry, in his acceptance speech of being an MVP, talked about his mother as the true MVP. And in fact, Terry said to me, we're having his mom share her testimony at our service. And I thought, we don't have Terry's mom here to share testimony, but let me show this 90-second video clip of Kevin Durant talking about his mom.
One of the best members. Best memories I had is when we moved into our.
So here we see Kevin Durant talking about his mom being the MVP. Let's look at some scriptural examples of the impact moms have made looking at their kids and not just seeing the present, but seeing the future. Turn with me to Exodus chapter 2. Exodus 2. And the first mom we're going to talk about is Jochebed. I don't know if you've we're going to read, we don't even read her name in Exodus 2. Later on in Exodus 6, we hear about Moses' family. In the book of Numbers, again, Moses' family. In Exodus 2, she's simply recognized as Moses' mom. And in chapter 1, the end of chapter 1, we see the setting. Pharaoh gave an order to all the people, every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. So the Hebrew people are growing in population. Pharaoh is basically practicing infanticide. And he says, if a boy is born, throw him into the Nile. Look at chapter 2, verse 1. A man from the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. This is Jochebed. She became pregnant, gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. So first we see her courage. For 3 months, she sees that her son is healthy. For 3 months, she's going to hide him. And as we see like with Matt and Annalisa right now, Cooper, nice and quiet. You kind of hardly even know he's around, maybe until it comes the middle of the night. And by 3 months, that begins to change. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. And then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So Moses' mom, Jochebed, she comes up with a plan. She takes the papyrus reeds, puts them together, takes some pitch and some tar, coats it so that it's going to float. She places it amongst the reeds along the bank of the Nile, and she says to Miriam, Joseph's sister, older sister, go stand along the Nile and see what happens. Kind of ironically, she is following Pharaoh's decree. First, in courage, she's hiding her child. Then, in faith, she lets go. She places him in the Nile, asks Miriam to go and watch what's going to happen. We know the end of the story if we know the story of Moses. We know that Moses is the one who comes and calls out to Pharaoh to let God's people go. They are able to escape from Egypt. They cross the Red Sea, all that great stuff. But it starts here with Jochebed having courage, having faith, not just in her present situation, but to focus not just on her hardship, but on the future. Making plans for the future, allowing Miriam to watch out, letting go. And as we follow the story, we see Pharaoh's daughter. Verse 5, Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it, saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. As the story unfolds, we see, interestingly enough here, in Exodus 2, it's almost anonymous women who step in and make a difference. It begins with Moses' mom. It continues with Miriam, who's unnamed as well, Moses' sister. Then here, Pharaoh's daughter goes down to the Nile. In her compassion, she sees she feels sorry for Moses. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she says. Verse 7. Then Moses' sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you? Yes, go, she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Here we see God's mercy, God's grace. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby, nurse him for me, I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter. She became her son. She named him Moses, saying, I drew you out of the water. Here, Jochebed, having courage, having faith, having the ability even to let go. Maybe that's the hardest thing. When you love your children, to love them enough as maybe they age, to let go, to trust them into the Lord's care, which is what Jochebed does. We see Jochebed trusting the future of Moses into God's hands. Moses, who eventually ends slavery. We see here the faith and the courage of his mother. She saw the present situation not just for what it was, but for what it could become. There's a story of Howard Hendricks. Maybe some of us are familiar with that name. Howard Hendricks was a professor of preaching at Dallas Seminary. For many years, he trained speakers that would change the world. People like Chuck Swindoll. And he died in 2013. He talks about his own childhood. His parents split up after his birth. Howard Hendricks was raised by his grandmother. His fifth grade teacher, Miss Simon, once tied him up to his chair with rope and taped his mouth shut. So for all the teachers here, think of that one student. You would love to do it. but it's 2014, not 1950 something or whatever. Tied him up in a chair, taped his mouth shut. She said this of him. She called him the worst behaved child in the school. She predicted that Howard would end up in prison. That was 5th grade. 6th grade. Howard's 6th grade teacher was Miss No. N-O-E. She saw him sitting in his, first day of class, she saw Howard sitting there with his arms crossed. She calls his name. She says this, "I've heard a lot about you, but I don't believe a word about it." Miss No realized that Howard needed somebody who cared. And this is what, as Howard talks about it, he says this, "Suddenly, unexpectedly, somebody believed in me." He said this was a fundamental turning point, not only in my education, but in my life. He said, in previous years, I skipped assignments, but now I stayed up till 1 a.m. to complete special assignments for Miss No. 5th grade for Howard Hendricks was the worst year of his life. 6th grade changed his life. And why? Because a teacher was willing to see in Howard not who he was, but who he would become. And the same is true for us. Here we see Jochebed with Moses and difficult circumstances, trusting God for what would become. A teacher changes the life of a student because they believe in what will become. For us, in whatever circumstance we have in life, instead of seeing it just for what it is and being discouraged. Because honestly, if we look at life simply for what it is today, maybe it's our finances, maybe it's relationships, difficult relationships. Maybe it's our job. If we see the world just as what it is, if we see our marriage just for what it is, maybe we become discouraged. But with hope in the Lord, to see what it might become, changes everything. We focus on the future. Let's look at another Old Testament woman. And this is Hannah. Hannah, the mother who built an army. How did she build an army? Well, it was through Samuel. 1 Samuel 1:11. Let me back up. In fact, let me flip over to 1 Samuel. Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel 1, because I want to read a few verses before verse 11. We see here in 1 Samuel 1 that in verse 2, it here talks about Hannah's husband, Elkanah. Elkanah had 2 wives, 1 Samuel 1:2. One was called Hannah, the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had none. Here we see in Hannah the reality of being childless. And year after year, verse 3, Elkanah went up from his town to worship. He sacrificed to the Lord. Verse 4, whenever the day came for Elkanah to sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to his wife Peninnah and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her and the Lord had closed her womb. In Hannah's day, if you did not have children, it was considered to be a curse from God. Surely we know that is not the reality. And for all of us, we recognize the difficulties of couples who want to have children and can't. At the same time, we recognize there's times where there's unplanned pregnancies. And we say, how does God work all of that out? And often we don't understand. And that was Hannah's situation. That was her pain. That was her challenge. on top of that, we see this example in the Old Testament where Elkanah, her husband, had 2 wives. We see that's not God's plan either. This bigamous relationship, the rivalries that resulted. And so Hannah had nowhere to turn but to the Lord. She cried out to God in the midst of her pain, in the midst of her current circumstance. And again, for Hannah, she chose to focus on the future, to trust in the Lord. Verse 11, she made a vow saying, "O Lord Almighty, if you look upon your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life." In the midst of her hurt and her pain, she had a God-honoring dream. And as we think about focusing on the future, there's a piece of this that we need to not leave out. Certainly, we need to focus on the future. What can become? We need to have a vision, and a vision fuels us. But there also may be some pain in our current circumstance, and we need God's grace to free us. A vision will fuel us for the future. It might help us rise out of discouragement, but at the same time, we need God's grace. This isn't just wishful thinking. It's believing in a God who, in his grace and mercy, can bring healing and help in the midst of our pain. Hannah had that painful relationship. And for us, we need to experience God's grace as well. For some of us, we might come here today, and in the midst of the hurt and challenge we face, maybe there's a place where we need healing, where we need forgiveness, where we need God's grace and mercy to break through. We need more than just wishful thinking about the future. We need a God who can minister to our spirit. And that's what God offers us in Jesus Christ. He offers us forgiveness. He offers us healing. He offers us hope. The third woman that we see today. Oh, and let me also just share our memory verse today. We've had some memory verses each week. And our memory verse for today comes from Philippians. And it's a verse that helps us focus on the future, not be tied to the past. Let's do this. Can we read this together? We read the real short verse last week. With God, all things are possible. It was very short. Today, it's a little bit longer, Philippians 3:13. Let's read this together. Brothers and sisters, I do not consider myself yet to have taken hold of it, but one thing I do, forgetting what is behind and straining toward what is ahead. My football coach in high school said, jet pilots don't have rear view mirrors. And if we'd come off a tough loss, don't focus on the loss, look to the future. Paul is saying that here to us as well. The third woman today is Sarah. Sarah believed a promise. Sarah wasn't just a mother. Sarah, maybe we could describe as the laughing mother. God gave her a promise. You're going to have a child. Well, she was beyond childbearing years. But she believed the promise. In fact, Hebrews 11:11, let me read that verse for us. Hebrews 11, a testimony of people of faith. It says, Hebrews 11:11, by faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. Here, Sarah believed the promise of God. She believed that God would be faithful, and God fulfilled that promise. The verse I chose to highlight from Sarah's life was actually when she had died. The setting is that Abraham wants to purchase a cave in the promised land to bury Sarah. Here we see Abraham honoring his wife, wanting her to be buried in Canaan, in the promised land. Ephron, the Hittite, was with his people, and he said, no, you can't just have the cave, take the field with it. And Abraham here, as we read Genesis 23, 10 to 13, let me just read the verses for us here. It says, Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people. He replied to Abraham in the hearing of all the Hittites who came to the gate of his city, "No, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." Again, Abraham bowed down before the people of the land, and he said to Ephron in his hearing, "Listen to me, if you will. I will pay the price of the field. Accept it from me so I can bury my dead there." When we read this, we think, oh, Ephron is just being generous. He wants to give him not only the cave, but the field as well. Really what he's doing, this is Bedouin negotiation. He doesn't literally want to give it to him. He wants him to buy both. And Abraham recognizes that for him to secure this burial site, for them actually to have land in the promised land that God had promised them, he needed to purchase it. He paid full price. Sarah was so important. The promise of God was so important that he was willing to pay full price. He had to own the land. It had to be there, not just for Sarah, but for Abraham, for Isaac, for Rebekah. And as we think of hope and our future, with Jochebed, who stepped out in courage and faith, with Hannah, who in her pain and in her challenge called out to God. And here's Sarah, a woman who believed a promise, gave birth to a nation through Isaac. Here we see Abraham paying full price, recognizing the promise of God. Again, thinking not just of the present, but the future. Abraham laying a groundwork of his people, his clan would have the promised land. They'd be buried in the promised land. The thought we need to carry with us, and that we see God in our own lives living out, is what can your life become? Not just focus on today. When we think of what our life will become, it will change our lives. Now let me go back to what I said about Hannah and Jesus. It isn't just wishful thinking, but it's trusting in a God who values his promise to us, who values relationship with us so much that he was willing to pay full price. He sent his son Jesus so that our lives wouldn't just be what they are today in the midst of our own challenge, of our own sinfulness, the realities of the sinful world around us, but it's believing in a God who loved us so much, who knew what we could become, just like a good mother, knew what we could become, that he sent his son. He paid full price. He gave his all in Jesus Christ so that we could be his children. On this Mother's Day, as we think of relationship, as we think of a focus on the future, trusting in a God who loves us and sees us for what we can become. Let's pray together.